Hi guys, this is K964 here, and I'll be explaining how I made it to Mythic rank number 1 through this deck. Now, it's a version of a Boros burn deck, which focuses more on instants and sorceries. Now, the most important card in this deck is the Radiant Scroll Wielder. Not only does it give all our damage spells lifelink, it also returns them from our graveyard so we can play them again. It's very good against aggro decks, as the lifelink keeps you alive and the graveyard ability allows you to get rid of the opponent's creatures easily. Its 4 toughness is also enough to dodge most red aggro damage spells. The deck also runs 4 copies of Rome Carolus Stalwart Slayer. It provides +1 damage to all our damage spells, which is handy against life gain decks, especially against the Router's Valkyrie and Bishop of Wings. The haste ability also allows it to put pressure on the opponents from the get-go. The 2 other creatures from this deck is Terraf's Disciple, a handy alchemy card which summons Lightning Bolt, and Bone Crusher Giant, which also provides some damage. Terraf's Disciple is the card you want when versing control decks, as the haste ability and the constant 3 damage can be too much if the opponent can't get rid of it. You've probably also noticed by now that the deck runs 2 copies of Challenger Heart of Fire. The reason why I included it in this deck is its first +1 ability, which is discard your hand, then exile the top 3 cards of your library, and you may play those cards until your next turn. This is very useful late game because this deck does not have any card draw at all. The ability to also deal 2 damage to any target is also very useful. In terms of damage spells, we have our Lightning Helix and our Lightning Strikes. The Lightning Helix is very effective against red aggro decks, as the life gain is very useful. Combine this with Radiant Scroll Wielder, and you have a spell that deals 3 damage and gains you 6 life, all for 2 mana. The other 2 mana damage spell is a Static Discharge. Practically, it deals 3 damage +1 for every time you cast a spell. The only downside is it is a sorcery, so you can't really play it at instant speed. However, if you don't have Static Discharge, you can play Royal Erupt instead. The deck also utilizes 4 copies of both Shock and Play with Fire. It's pretty straightforward. If you're targeting a creature, use your Shock over a Play with Fire, and if you're targeting the player, use your Play with Fire over your Shock. The one thing this deck does lack is the ability to destroy enchantments and artifacts. Rip Apart does solve this problem, however I'm not playing Rip Apart. The reason why I'm not doing this is because I prefer all my damage spells to be able to target the player, because if you're versing a control deck or you're just drawing cards and you need something to end the game, then you don't want to be drawing Rip Apart, which deals 3 damage to a creature or a planeswalker, and it can't damage the player. Generally, also, if you're playing against artifact decks, especially the colorless artifacts decks, you really want to end them before they can get their game-winning artifacts on the board. So being able to damage the player and end the game is also very handy. Another very handy card that you could have is Risk Factor. I used to play 4 copies of Risk Factor. However, I also like being able to kill my opponent's creatures, and just the more flexibility, especially of a card like Shock, because if you have 3 mana, you can play a Shock and a Lightning Strike, or you can play a Risk Factor, and I just think a Shock and a Lightning Strike deals 5 damage to the player, while a Risk Factor is only 4 damage. The ability to jumpstart is also very useful, however, you have to discard it, and we are getting cards back from the graveyard through Radiant Scroll Wielder anyway. The other handy card here is Cinderplasm. I used to play 2 copies of Cinderplasm in this deck. Its instant speed is very useful. However, once again, it can't damage the player, which is why I don't use it in this deck. The other useful card in this sideboard is a Banefire. Banefires aren't that useful early game. However, late game, especially if you're playing a control deck which counters all your spells, a Banefire can get the job done, assuming you've managed to deal some damage before they've gained control of the game. Now in terms of land, I just run whatever Boros cards land cards I've gotten over the years. However, if I did have more wild cards, I would strongly recommend to play at least 2 copies of the Den of Bugbear, and probably at least 1 copy of the Cave of the First Dragon. Also, probably another copy of Ijanjo, Seat of the Empire, would be handy. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into gameplay. I'll be analysing some matches that I played, and I'll be showing you why I did certain things and what to do against different types of decks. So anyway, let's get into it.